You know, there are moments in world history that we, the people living through them, might not immediately grasp the magnitude of. We get caught up in the daily news, the threats, the noisy arguments. But if you take a step back, look at the bigger picture, you'll see a seismic shift is happening. And at the center of that shift, surprisingly, is the world's largest democracy, India. I don't want to make this video, but I have to, because I've realized something that breaks my heart. Too many people, especially those who are getting older, are quietly giving up on life. Not because they're weak, not because they're lazy, but because the world has stopped believing in them. And when that happens, we tend to stop believing in ourselves. But if you're listening to this right now, that means one thing: you haven't completely given up. Not yet. And I'm going to tell you why that very decision is more powerful than you think. On July 30th, President Donald Trump threatened a 25% tariff on Indian exports. The official reason? Trade imbalance. The real reason? India is rising, fast, and Washington doesn't like what it can't control. Let me tell you something. As a man who conquered America from the outside, first through bodybuilding, then Hollywood, then politics, I understand what it means to challenge established power structures. And what I'm seeing now is India doing exactly what I did decades ago, refusing to play by someone else's rules and building its own path to the top. India isn't just catching up. They're building a parallel future. And it's making the old superpowers very, very uncomfortable. For over a century, the United States has been the global pacesetter for technology, economics, and even culture. But now, we're seeing a new kind of nation rise. Not by copying the West, but by doing something far more interesting, competing on its own terms. And as a person who never accepted being told I couldn't achieve something, I recognize this mindset immediately. This isn't just about tariffs. This is about control. And right now, India is liberating itself. The US knows it, and it's worried. Can you feel it, the energy that's just exploding from the east? India isn't just rising, it's building a parallel future, a model of development that doesn't copy but redefines. And it's making the old powers nervous because they're used to being at the center of every orbit. Just look at the numbers, they don't lie. India is already the world's fifth largest economy, and it's on track to be the third largest by the end of the decade, potentially surpassing Japan and Germany. But this isn't just about GDP. This is about the kind of power India is becoming. Over 1.4 billion people, and most of them are under the age of 30. That's a demographic boom supercharged by technology. 1 billion smartphones, over 900 million internet users by next year. You are, in essence, watching the largest connected democracy ever built come online in real time. Imagine the consumer power, the creative power, and the innovative power of a population that massive. That's not just a market, that's a global growth engine. And here's the craziest part, they're doing it with homegrown tools. Their digital payment system, UPI, isn't just competing with Visa and MasterCard. It's blowing past them in transaction volume, handling over 640 million transactions per day and accounting for nearly 50% of the world's total real-time digital payments. That shows technological self-reliance and a capacity for innovation that is off the charts. Their space agency, ISRO, landed Chandrayaan-3 on the moon's south pole for less than the budget of a single Hollywood movie. And yes, they're planning a crewed spaceflight called Gaganyaan in 2026. This isn't just about science, it's about national pride, self-sufficiency, and asserting their place in the global space race. This progress isn't accidental, it's strategic. India is pushing to be a leader in semiconductors, quantum computing, defense manufacturing, and green energy. Not by importing innovation but by building ecosystems. And with programs like Make in India, they aren't just talking, they're scaling at an incredible pace. Apple, Tesla suppliers, Google data centers, they're all moving to India. Why? Because India isn't just a market. It's an alternative manufacturing option to China. And in a world defined by disrupted supply chains and shifting alliances, that is huge. As someone who built multiple empires by understanding systematic progress, I can tell you that this is what a real strategic build looks like. India isn't just catching up, it's rewriting the game. So what does this mean for the United States? Well, let's be honest. Washington is used to being the axis of power. When the US calls, countries typically listen. But India listens and then makes its own decision. And that's the part that people in Washington are starting to realize. India isn't becoming an ally in the traditional sense. It's becoming a pole of its own, self-reliant, independent, pragmatic. And that terrifies policymakers not because India is hostile, but because it is sovereign. That's a very different kind of power. A kind of power that doesn't ask for permission. But here's the interesting part. This isn't about rivalry. This is about multipolar stability. The idea that the future won't be dominated by a single superpower but shaped by multiple credible voices. And India is now one of those voices. So, yes, the US feels the pressure. Yes, Trump's tariffs are a reaction. But don't confuse the reaction with the reality, because the truth is that India isn't rising to challenge anyone. It's rising because it finally can. And for 1 billion people who have waited generations for their chance, that's not a threat. That's a destiny that has finally arrived. So, if you're still wondering why the US is suddenly making noise about trade deficits and Russian oil, it's not just about economics. It's about the world realizing that India doesn't have to follow anymore. It's ready to lead. Let's dive into the real mechanics behind Trump's 25% tariff threat on India. Because this isn't just a random political outburst or a grab for headlines. It's a very calculated move, driven by leverage, power dynamics, and, frankly, old assumptions about how global influence is supposed to work. Let's start with trade. The US has always operated under the assumption that its market is the prize and that access to it comes with strings attached. For decades, that made sense. America had the deepest pockets, the most consumers, and the technology every nation wanted. But fast forward to 2025, and the game has changed. India isn't just manufacturing for the US anymore. They're manufacturing for themselves and the rest of the world. The Trump team argues that Indian exports, textiles, auto parts, electronics, pharmaceuticals, enjoy unfair access to the US market, while US goods face high tariffs in India. They say it's too much of a one-sided deal. And on a raw numbers basis, they're partially right. For example, India's average tariff on US agricultural products is around 39%, while the US tariff on Indian goods is closer to 7%. But here's the kicker. India has 1.4 billion people. Many of them live in rural or semi-urban areas. You can't just throw open the market to American corn, milk, or wheat and expect the local farmers to survive. This isn't protectionism. This is domestic preservation. The Indian government is trying to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty without collapsing its rural economy in the process. But for Trump, nuance isn't the point. Leverage is. His approach to trade isn't about mutual benefit. It's about winning more. If you start buying Russian oil, if you start buying Russian defense systems, and if you start not allowing American farm products into your market, he squeezes you. That's the Trump doctrine, plain and simple. So, when India continued to buy Russia's S-400 missile system despite threats from Kotsa, countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, and started importing discounted Russian oil during the Ukraine war, Washington took it personally. Not because India was violating any treaty. They weren't. But because they had made an independent decision. And that's the part they can't stomach. Let's talk strategy. The US is currently locked in a fierce competition with China. They see India as a natural counterweight in Asia. But here's the contradiction. The US wants India to be a partner, but it also wants India to behave like a junior partner, and that's not going to happen anymore. India wants strategic autonomy, the freedom to do business with the US, Russia, France, Japan, or whomever they choose. That isn't defiance. That's diplomacy in a multipolar world. So why now? Why did Trump publicly threaten tariffs in July 2025? Because he's in campaign mode. He wants to show American voters that he's tough on trade, tough on China, tough on anyone not playing fair. India just became the latest target. Not because they're weak, but because they're visible. That's the irony. The stronger India gets, the more pressure it faces. Not just from enemies, but from allies. Because power attracts friction. And Trump knows it. He's using India as an example, a warning to other nations: play by American terms or pay the price. But here's the problem with that logic. It assumes the old playbook still works. That tariffs and threats will get countries back in line. What it doesn't account for is a new generation of nations that are confident, self-sufficient, and unafraid to realign their own path. India isn't rejecting the US. They're simply not submitting. And that is what has triggered Trump. Here's something a lot of people don't realize: India is no longer playing a binary game. They aren't choosing between the East and the West. They're building their own network. Think of it like a new kind of operating system. One that doesn't rely on a single app store. It's modular, flexible, and built for sovereignty. Yes, India buys defense equipment from Russia. That's not new news. But the bigger story is that India is diversifying faster than most countries in the world. They aren't stuck in a Cold War-era alliance. They are post-alignment. In the last 5 years, India has signed major defense and technology deals with the United States, France, Israel, the UK, and Japan. All while maintaining traditional partnerships with Russia. Take the Rafale deal, for example. It wasn't just a weapons purchase. It was India signaling to Europe, we are open for strategic partnerships. France didn't just sell jets. They co-developed technology, trained Indian engineers, and supported India's indigenous defense goals. That's a very different model from the old buyer-seller dependency. Then there's the India-UK 2030 roadmap, a long-term plan to collaborate on cybersecurity, clean energy, and digital trade. It's not flashy, but it's structural. It's creating foundations that last longer than headlines. And let's not forget Israel. India is one of their biggest defense customers and partners. Together, they've developed advanced surveillance systems, drones, and missile defense technology. But here's the key. India isn't just importing. They are co-developing, indigenizing, and integrating this tech into their own manufacturing ecosystems. This brings us to a crucial point. India isn't just buying power. They're building self-reliant defense capabilities. By 2025, more than 70% of India's military procurement budget is dedicated to domestic manufacturing. HAL, DRDO, Bharat Dynamics. These are not just government agencies anymore. They are becoming global defense exporters. On the civilian side, India is making smart moves, too. They're quietly signing bilateral trade deals with the UAE, Australia, South Korea, and the EU. These aren't symbolic handshakes. These are supply chain restructures, green hydrogen alliances, digital trade corridors. India isn't waiting for a global consensus. They're building regional resilience. They're also taking the lead in the global south, partnering with Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America on infrastructure, education, and pharmaceutical access. Not to dominate, but to collaborate at scale. Think of it as a distributed system, decentralized, resilient, unaligned, but networked. This is what Washington sometimes misses. India isn't rejecting the West. It's balancing it. They're still in the Quad. They still invest in US technology, but they also buy oil from Russia, drones from Israel, and sign climate pacts with the EU. That's not defiance. That's called freedom of choice. And frankly, that's what every nation should aspire to, a future where diplomacy isn't about picking sides but making smart, sovereign decisions. So, when Trump or any American leader pressures India to conform, what they're really saying is, we don't want you to choose your own path. We want you to follow ours. And that's an outdated mindset, because this century doesn't belong to any single nation. It belongs to diverse, sovereign nations that know how to adapt and cooperate. And right now, India is doing exactly that. Let's ask the uncomfortable question that no one in Washington wants to answer out loud: is the United States losing its global influence? The short answer, not entirely. But the monopoly is over. The longer answer, it's complicated. But yes, the balance is shifting. For most of the 20th century, the US wasn't just a superpower. It was the power. The dollar dominated trade. Silicon Valley dominated innovation. The Pentagon dominated deterrence. And US foreign policy shaped who got what and when. But now, things are moving fast. India's rise isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a larger pattern, a decentralized rebalancing of the global order. Think of it like a system upgrade. We're moving from version 1.0, unipolar and US-centric, to version 2.0, multipolar cooperation. And that's where the friction begins. Let's break it down. The US still has unparalleled military might, powerful global alliances, and immense cultural soft power. There's no disputing that. But when it comes to influence, the ability to shape other nations' decisions without coercion, that grip is weakening. Take the US dollar. It's still the dominant reserve currency. But more and more countries, including India, are settling transactions in local currencies. In fact, India and Russia have been trading oil in rupees. The UAE just did a deal with India in rupees and dirhams, bypassing the dollar entirely. That doesn't mean the dollar is going to collapse tomorrow, but it signals something deeper. Nations are exploring alternatives, and alternatives mean independence. Then there's diplomacy. India is a founding member of BRICS, which now includes powers like Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, and others. They're building their own payment systems, energy networks, and even development banks. The US is not a part of that conversation, and that's by design. India also hosted the G20 summit last year and made it clear that its vision for the global economy isn't centered on Western hegemony. It's centered on shared growth, digital inclusion, and resilience. Here's the interesting part. The US still views influence as hierarchical, top-down. You're either with us or against us. But nations like India see it differently. Influence isn't a chain of command. It's a network of trust. India's foreign policy doctrine is simple: multi-alignment. Trade with the US, buy arms from Russia. Build solar infrastructure with the UAE. Partner with Japan on semiconductors. That's not disloyalty. That's smart foreign policy in the 21st century. And for the US, that's hard to accept, because it means their playbook is no longer being followed. Trump's 25% tariff threat isn't just about trade figures or Russian oil deals. It's a reaction to the erosion of leverage. A decade ago, the US could get what it wanted with a phone call. Today, it has to compete, on price, on influence, on diplomacy. So, is the US losing influence? It's not collapsing, but it's no longer the sole decision-maker. And in a world where India is rising, Africa is asserting itself, and Latin America is realigning, American dominance isn't a guarantee. It's a negotiation. The real challenge isn't India's strength. It's America's inability to adapt to a world that isn't waiting for instructions. And that's where things are headed, from command to collaboration. There's a phrase you hear a lot in Indian foreign policy circles: strategic autonomy. It's not flashy. It's not loud. But it may be one of the most disruptive ideas in 21st century geopolitics, because what it really means is, we partner with everyone, but we submit to no one. For decades, the international system was binary. You were either in the US camp or the Soviet camp. But today, nations like India are reshaping that equation. They're saying, we're not interested in being someone's satellite. We're interested in being economically, militarily, and diplomatically sovereign. That is powerful, and it's exactly what frustrates Washington, because India isn't refusing to cooperate. It's refusing conditional alignment. The US wants India to fully commit to the Western Bloc, especially as tensions with China and Russia escalate. But India's response has been clear: we work with you, but we decide the terms. This became obvious during the Russia-Ukraine war. The US expected India to condemn Russia, adhere to sanctions, and cut energy ties. But India didn't. Not because they supported the war, they didn't, but because they weren't outsourcing their foreign policy to another capital. They continued to buy discounted Russian oil, ensuring energy security for their 1.4 billion citizens. And they maintained a neutral stance at the UN, choosing diplomacy over division. Now, look at defense. India is participating in joint exercises with the US Navy while also conducting military drills with Russia and even China. That's not a mixed message. That's unaligned pragmatism. India understands that true independence comes from choice, from not putting all your security eggs in one geopolitical basket. And here's what makes India's position so unique. They're not trying to be the next superpower in the traditional sense. They're not invading nations. They're not building foreign bases. They're not pushing an ideology. They're just building resilience through manufacturing, energy diversification, space technology, financial technology, and diplomacy. This kind of self-determination is exactly what breaks old power structures. The US, for example, has typically expected loyalty in exchange for partnership. But India is offering something else: partnership on an equal footing. They don't want to be told who to trade with, who to sanction, or what side of history to stand on. They're choosing their own side, the side of India. And to be fair, that is what any responsible nation should do. In a multipolar world, sovereignty is the most valuable currency. And India is accumulating it fast by being neutral when it makes sense, firm when it's necessary, and flexible when it's strategic. So when Trump or any US official complains that India isn't doing enough, what they're really saying is, India isn't doing what we want. But that's the whole point. India doesn't need permission anymore. It needs partners, not principles. Strategic autonomy isn't isolationism. It's smart engagement. It's saying, we're in the room. We're at the table, but we're here on our own terms. That's not defiance. That's modern diplomacy. And India is mastering it. So here we are. A former US president has threatened a 25% tariff on Indian exports. Tense negotiations. Noisy headlines. But let's step back, look at the big picture, and the question becomes, what really happens next? Well, here's what won't happen: India will not panic. They will not buckle under pressure, because this isn't the India of 1991. This is the India of 2025, a nuclear power, a space innovator, and the planet's largest democracy. The India that once relied on foreign aid now sends satellites to the moon. The India that once negotiated from a position of weakness now shapes the tone at the G20. And in this new world, economic threats just don't have the same bite they used to. Tariffs might cause temporary pain. Yes, Indian exporters, especially in textiles, gems, and electronics, could take a short-term hit. But in the long run, this could actually accelerate India's economic pivot. Indian trade officials have been strengthening ties with Africa, the EU, and the Middle East. Bilateral deals are being fast-tracked. Rupee payments are expanding, and "Make in India" is becoming less of a slogan and more of a manufacturing reality. The real risk isn't to India. It's to the United States. Because if the US pushes too hard, it could drive India further toward economic independence and diplomatic hedging. In trying to control the partnership, the US might lose it entirely. Think about it this way. In software, if your platform becomes too closed, developers move on. In geopolitics, if your diplomacy becomes too conditional, partners diversify. And right now, India is diversifying. But here's the good news. This doesn't have to become a breakup. It could become a breakthrough. The US and India share common values, democracy, innovation, and a belief that the future should be shaped, not inherited. If both sides choose respect over control, they could build something far more powerful than a trade deal. They could build a model for equitable global cooperation in a multipolar century. So what happens next? India will continue to rise. It will continue to say no when it needs to and yes when it makes sense. It will partner, compete, and lead on its own terms. Not to dominate the world, but to balance it. The tariff threats are just noise. The real signal is this: the world is changing, and India isn't asking for permission anymore. They aren't waiting. They're building. And the world is finally watching.